Hey, what's going on, guys? Just want to talk to you today a little bit about pre-production and more on the technical side of things and things to make sure your session goes well. So the last thing you want to do is go into a session the day of and you have issues with your gear, and that's what's actually slowing you down. It's not the playing or the performing, it's just technical problems. So I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of some common instruments, common things that often come into the studio, and like what to look for and what to be accountable for, really. And really this kind of comes on to the individual, for you and your instrument, and having it prepared and ready to go. Make sure there's no issues throughout that entire instrument and the signal chain, whatever you have set up. All right, so let's go ahead and start off with the drums. If the studio is not using a house kit and you're bringing in your own drum kit, which can be great, totally fine, it's important to make sure that your drum kit is up to par and doesn't cause any issues during the session. So a good example of things that you need to kind of look for are, one, is your kit stable, or is the hardware solid, nothing's falling over, nothing's broken? Because if something falls over or anything like that in the session, then that's obviously going to be an issue during the take and stuff like that. Make sure your bass drum pedal is actually, there's not too squeaky or too noisy or anything like that. Same thing with the hi-hat pedal. Anything like that that's moving can cause noise that you may or may not want in the recording. Most likely you don't want it. So that would be first kind of check. Make sure all that stuff's good. Then I would look at all your cymbals and make sure that there's no cracks or holes or anything like that that really changes the sound. And it can be subjective to a certain point of how you actually like that sound. It can be possible that it's like, oh, that's actually kind of a cool sound, but I've had the opposite experience where I was recording, a drummer, and get to mixing, and I'm like, what's wrong with the hi-hat? It sounds really weird. And then I go and look at the drummer's hi-hat, and I'm like, oh, it's cracked. And I had no idea. And the guy was like, oh yeah, it's been like that, and he didn't think to fix it or change it at all. And it's like, man, we can't change that sound, and it wasn't a good sound in my opinion. So that would be something to really look at, or communicate to the producer and the engineer and be like, hey, this one's actually like this. I drilled a hole in it to stop the crack from going further, but I actually like how it sounds, just so you know. So if you just communicate that could be cool. And worst things come to worst, you could just audition a few cymbals too, especially if the house studio has cymbals and a house kit and things like that. So moving on from cymbals, I would look at all the drum heads, including the tuning, and how old and new the drum heads are. If you can afford it, absolutely buy new drum heads and put them on there. They have so much more life and attack and response, and it'll just translate so much better to a good recording. But then you do have to break them in a little bit, and you need to tune them and make sure you get them to the right spot. If you don't know how to tune, you can talk to the engineer at the studio about that, and there's plenty of content that you can look up as well to try and learn how to do that. But it's really important that you get that the best that you can. So yeah, I would check all the tuning, get new heads on everything, and even check things like your snare wires. Make sure you don't have any broken, busted snare wires on the bottom of your snare. All those kind of things. If all that stuff is good, then you're probably looking pretty good on the drums and everything. I guess the last thing I could think of is make sure that the rug or carpet that you have is solid and that the kit's not moving or flying away from you. If it is, just bring some sandbags or something like that, throw it in front of the kick drum, and that's cool. And now that I'm talking about the kick drum, also dampening and muffling the kick drum. Make sure you kind of know what that is and how you like that as well. That almost always is muffled and dampened for most genres. There are some where you want to keep it open and things like that, but that's all stuff that you can talk to about with the engineer and the producer. So yeah, and then for your sticks, make sure those are good and clean too. We don't want anything too busted or broken. You just want to have nice solid sticks that sound appropriate when you are hitting the drums and things like that. You don't want something that's about to break and then it breaks in the middle of a take or something like that. All right, so that's kind of from the drummer's perspective. Moving on, let's go ahead and move the bass. So as the bass player, mainly it's going to be about the bass guitar. A lot of times you're just going in direct, so you're not even using an amp and things like that. But things to look for on bass is, well, we want to make sure the input jacks and all that stuff is good to go, that you're not getting a bunch of noise and stuff like that, or that the cables going from the jack to the DI or amp or whatever is causing noises if you move a little bit. Again, new strings. Please put new strings on there unless you're going for a really old and like thuddy, like Motown type of sound, which honestly would probably be flats and things like that. But that's all stuff you need to consider. Do I need flats? Do I need round wound strings? You know, am I playing with a pick? Am I playing with my fingers? Is it a slap thing? All those things are important to, you know, that's how you set up your instrument and bring it in prepared. All those things kind of work together. So if you can think about that and just have a plan, then things will probably go a lot smoother with that. Now let's say you do bring an amp. That's great. Just make sure that your amp is ready to go. If it's a tube amp, it needs to have the tubes, you know, they'll be fine, but you need to have some backups just in case they go out in the middle of the session. Check for noise issues as well. You could have a noisy instrument or something like that, or the amp could be really noisy, and those will slow down a recording session immediately if it's too noisy. So those are definitely things you want to try to minimize and, you know, avoid as much as possible. And then I guess the last thing is if you have a pedal board, and really this kind of applies to guitar players too, but what I'm saying applies to guitar players and bass players really, is we want to make sure that the pedal board is patched correctly, everything is working. We have dedicated power supplies for all the pedals and stuff like that, so you don't want to necessarily be running things off batteries or something like that. And we want to make sure that all of the cables are good, so that'll be something you check, you know, whenever you're sound checking and line checking your instrument and things like that. But pedal boards are something that oftentimes cause a lot of issues just because there's multiple things being connected. And that's just what happens. The more things you connect, the more chances of there being a point of failure. So that's something I would look at as well. And then, like I said, tubes with the amps, always have a backup pair just in case. And then new strings if you can do that. Make sure that well, this is kind of not you being prepared, but sometimes with single coil instruments, you actually need to turn a certain way in the room, which sounds weird, but you might have to turn 90 degrees or something like that. And the reason why is because that actually lowers the amount of hum that's being recorded, which makes it better for mixing and things like that. So those are all kind of small detailed things that you would be surprised, but they all add up, or it can slow down a session, or it can stop a session completely. So that's what I'd look for from as a bass or guitar player. And then moving on, let's go ahead and talk about I think vocals would be a good one to talk about next, which would be pretty simply for vocalists. It's like you really just need to make sure that you're warmed up, your voice is well rested. Those are kind of the big ones, because it's just you and your body. So that's really on you to just be prepared, take care of yourself, you know, and just be ready to sing when it's time to sing. So you don't want to do anything. You don't want to be like, if you played a show last night and your voice is really tired or worn out, it's probably not a good idea to plan a session the next day. So stuff like that that's really more about the planning and preparation from that standpoint, more than it is about a technical gear aspect or something like that. I guess for other things like keyboards, synthesizers, or drum machines, more like electronic plug-in instruments, make sure all that stuff is, you know, that stuff is generally a little bit easier, because it's usually you just plug one thing in and it's, you know, power, it has a dedicated power, so you just plug it in and it turns on. But you want to make sure the 1/4-inch cables coming out of it and things like that are good, and that you're not having any weird noise issues. Make sure the sustain pedal's working, you know, properly, you know, or that it's not too squeaky or anything like that. You want to make sure that that you have all your presets dialed in and ready to go as well, that they're saved and things like that. And then for drum machines or anything that you're like sample based that you're loading in, same deal. But really, there isn't as many things to worry about with that kind of stuff. That stuff generally is plug and play. So, but still, double check it, make sure you're good to go, and you should have a smoother session. So those are kind of what I would call more common instruments that get recorded most of the time, versus like a woodwind instrument or a brass instrument, things like that. Those don't get recorded quite as much, but really these same ideas apply to every instrument, every person, and really it's kind of on you as the player and the performer and the musician to be prepared. Make sure your instrument and your entire signal chain, everything that you're going to be doing, is in good shape. You don't want to slow down the session. You don't want to be the person who's, well, we're 2 hours behind because, guitar players sorting through pedals and stuff like that. Just be as prepared as you can. Stuff can still happen even when you do that, but if you've done your preparation, your homework and things like that, you'll minimize the chances of that happening, and then you deal with it if it comes up and you move on from it. That's kind of my thoughts and experience on what can help you guys as the individual and the musician, the player, be ready and prepared for the session to make sure there aren't any technical hiccups or anything like that. So hope that helps. Thanks, guys.